The air in worn sneakers. Wilder Ashford pushed through the heavy double doors of Ridgemont Academy on a Monday morning in late September, his worn canvas sneakers making soft, squeaking sounds against the polished marble floor. The shoes had seen better days. The left sole was separating near the toe, held together with superglue that left visible streaks, and both laces were frayed at the ends where he'd tied clumsy knots to keep them from unraveling completely. His jeans, faded and slightly too short, revealed threadbare socks above the shoes' collapsing backs. The backpack slung over his shoulder was an ancient thing, probably purchased a decade ago, with one strap repaired using duct tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties and now hung in grey strips. Ridgemont Academy stood as one of the most prestigious private institutions in Connecticut, its sprawling campus nestled among manicured lawns and century-old oak trees. The main building's architecture spoke of old money, red brick facades, white columns, tall windows that let natural light flood the spacious hallways. Inside, everything gleamed. Trophy cases lined with athletic and academic achievements, walls painted in the school's colors of deep burgundy and gold, bulletin boards announcing upcoming galas and charity events where tickets cost more than some family's monthly rent. Wilder kept his head down as he navigated toward his locker, number 247, tucked in the less trafficked west corridor near the janitorial closet. The morning crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. Groups of students in designer clothing, carrying leather messenger bags and the latest smartphone models, discussing weekend trips to family vacation homes in the Hamptons or skiing in Vermont. They moved in their own orbits, their conversations filled with references to restaurants Wilder recognized only from glimpses through windows, brands he'd never worn, experiences that existed in a world parallel to but separate from his own. He'd been at Ridgemont for 3 weeks now, transferred in after the semester had already started. The administration's explanation to curious students had been vague, something about a family situation, a last-minute enrollment, paperwork sorted out just in time. No one had pressed for details, in a school where most students had attended together since elementary grades, where social hierarchies were established and calcified over years of shared history. A newcomer arriving mid-semester was noteworthy only for their obvious outsider status. His locker opened with a metallic screech that drew glances from passing students. Inside, he'd kept things minimal. Textbooks that were clearly used, their covers bent and pages dog-eared, a lunch bag made from brown paper, a single notebook that he'd been rationing pages from since he couldn't afford another. No decorations, no mirror, no photographs taped to the inside of the door like other students had, just the essentials arranged neatly in the cramped space. "Nice kicks, man." The voice came from behind him, dripping with sarcasm thick enough to cut. Wilder didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Bradford Cunningham III, Brad to his friends, though he introduced himself with the full name to emphasize the lineage, the legacy, the weight of 3 generations of Cunninghams who'd walked these halls before him. Brad stood at 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of lacrosse and private gym trainers, his sandy blonde hair styled with some product that probably cost more than Wilder's entire outfit. His uniform, because Ridgemont required them, though they allowed some personalization, fit perfectly, tailored to his frame, the burgundy blazer pressed without a single wrinkle, the gold tie knotted in a perfect Windsor. Wilder continued organizing his locker, pulling out the textbook for first-period American literature. His hands remained steady, his breathing even. He'd learned in the first week that reaction was fuel, that any response would be twisted into entertainment. "I'm talking to you, scholarship case." Brad stepped closer, his 2 constant companions flanking him like well-trained dogs. On Brad's right stood Garrett Hastings, tall and wiry, with dark hair and darker eyes that always seemed to be calculating the social benefit of every interaction. Garrett came from a family of lawyers. His father was a partner at some major firm downtown, his mother a judge, and he carried that legal precision into his cruelty, always careful to stay just on the acceptable side of rules while maximizing psychological impact. On Brad's left was Tyler Vance, built like a tank, a starting linebacker whose family owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. Tyler was the muscle, the physical presence, though he rarely needed to do more than exist in his intimidating bulk to make his point. "Those shoes from Goodwill?" Garrett asked, his voice pitched to carry down the hallway. A few students slowed their walking pace, pretending to check phones or dig through their own lockers while their attention fixed on the developing scene. "Or did you find them in a dumpster behind the mall?" Wilder closed his locker with careful deliberation, turning to face them with an expression that revealed nothing. His face was unremarkable in most ways, neither handsome nor ugly, just average, with features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, brown hair that needed a cut, falling into brown eyes that stayed hooded and guarded, a thin frame that suggested he'd never had access to personal trainers or nutritionists or even regular substantial meals. Everything about his appearance screamed poverty in an environment where wealth was the default setting, where even the least affluent students came from families that would be considered upper middle class anywhere else. "Excuse me," Wilder said quietly, moving to step around them. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if his very existence in their space was an intrusion that required forgiveness. Brad's arm shot out, blocking his path. "We're having a conversation here. It's rude to walk away when someone's talking to you." His blue eyes glittered with something predatory, a shark that had scented blood in the water. "Where do you say you transferred from?" "Public school? One of those places where they can't even afford textbooks?" "I didn't say." Wilder kept his gaze neutral, not challenging but not submissive either, walking a tightrope of response that he'd been perfecting for 3 weeks. Give them nothing to work with. No emotional reaction, no angry retort, no visible hurt. Be boring. Be forgettable. Survive. "Bet he's here on some diversity scholarship," Tyler rumbled, his voice carrying the particular thoughtlessness of someone who'd never had to consider his words before speaking them. Schools always trying to hit their quota of charity cases. Makes them look good to have some poor kid they can parade around. The small audience of students that had gathered tried to hide their smiles, some succeeding better than others. A few looked uncomfortable, their eyes sliding away from the scene, suddenly fascinated by their shoelaces or the ceiling tiles or the posters advertising the upcoming homecoming dance. None intervened, none spoke up. The unwritten rule at Ridgemont was clear. Don't make waves, don't draw attention, don't risk your own social standing by defending someone who had none. "I have class," Wilder said, his voice still quiet, still even. He moved to walk around Brad's outstretched arm, ducking under it with a fluid motion that was too smooth, too controlled, the movement of someone who'd been trained to be aware of spatial relationships and body mechanics. None of them noticed. They saw only what they wanted to see, a poor kid fleeing confrontation, too scared or weak to stand up for himself. He walked toward American literature, his footsteps echoing in the gradually emptying hallway as students scattered to their first period classes. Behind him he could hear Brad's voice, raised just enough to ensure Wilder would hear it. "Did you see those shoes? My gardener dresses better than that. Probably smells better too." Laughter followed him down the corridor, and Wilder's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only external sign of any internal response. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, not curling into fists, not trembling with suppressed rage or humiliation. He'd made a promise after all, a promise that had brought him here to this specific school, in these specific circumstances, wearing these specific worn-out shoes despite having others, many others, sitting in a closet, that was larger than most people's bedrooms. The classroom for American literature was located on the second floor, in the east wing, where morning sunlight poured through tall windows and made the dust motes visible in the air. Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with greying hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, had already begun taking attendance when Wilder slipped into his seat in the back row. He'd deliberately chosen that location on his first day, back corner by the window where he could see the entire room but remain peripheral to most people's awareness. The desk was old wood, scarred with generations of carved initials and doodles, and he ran his fingers over the grooves while Mrs. Patterson discussed their current novel, The Great Gatsby, drawing parallels between Gatsby's pursuit of the American dream and the modern American experience. The green light at the end of Daisy's dock represents hope, aspiration, the future that Gatsby believes he can obtain if only he accumulates enough. Wealth, enough status, enough of the markers of success, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice animated with the passion of someone who genuinely loved literature and somehow still believed she could transmit that love to teenagers who'd rather be checking Instagram. But what Fitzgerald is really showing us is that wealth alone can't purchase happiness, can't erase the past, can't fundamentally change who we are at our core. Gatsby reinvents himself, creates this elaborate persona, throws lavish parties, but in the end, it doesn't matter because Daisy's husband kills him anyway. Brad interrupted from his seat in the middle of the room, surrounded by his circle of friends who laughed dutifully at his interjection. Or wait, was that the other guy? Who cares? Dead is dead. All that money didn't save him. It was Wilson who killed Gatsby, actually, a voice said from 2 rows ahead of Wilder, and he looked up to see who had spoken. The voice belonged to a girl he'd noticed before, but had never directly interacted with, Sage Whitmore, who sat near the front and always had her hand up to answer questions, whose notes were color-coded and meticulous, who wore her chestnut hair in a perpetual ponytail that swayed when she turned her head. And the point isn't just that Gatsby died. The point is that his entire life was built on a fantasy, on the belief that he could recapture something that never really existed in the first place. His tragedy isn't just his death. It's that he never understood that what he was chasing was an illusion. Mrs. Patterson beamed. Excellent analysis, Sage. That's exactly the kind of critical thinking I want to see from all of you. Brad made a sound that might have been a cough, but sounded suspiciously like nerd, disguised in a throat clearing. Sage's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the jab. Wilder found himself studying her profile, the way she sat up straight in her chair, the determined set of her jaw, the way her pen gripped tightly in her hand suggested she was using every ounce of self-control not to respond. He recognized that posture. He wore it himself. The class continued with Mrs. Patterson guiding a discussion about symbolism and the unreliable narrator, about the difference between how Nick Carraway presents events and how readers might interpret them differently. Wilder participated minimally, offering only brief responses when directly called upon, his answers demonstrating that he'd done the reading, but revealing nothing about his own thoughts or interpretations beyond what was necessary. Staying invisible, staying safe. The 50-minute period crawled by, and when the bell finally rang, students erupted from their seats with the barely contained energy of young people forced to sit still for too long. Wilder gathered his worn textbook and single notebook, placing them carefully in his ancient backpack. He was one of the last to leave the classroom, a strategy he'd adopted to avoid the crowded hallways between periods when accidental collisions could happen, when books could be knocked from hands, when shoving matches could break out with predictable targets. As he stepped into the corridor, he saw Sage Whitmore standing by her locker, which happened to be in the same general area as his own, though hers was newer, in better condition, in a more desirable location where the popular students congregated. She was having what appeared to be a tense conversation with another girl, Presley Monroe, one of Brad's orbit, a girl whose family owned half the commercial real estate in town and who wore that ownership like a crown. Presley's arms were crossed, her perfectly manicured fingernails drumming against her designer blazer sleeve. Her expression a mixture of disdain and barely concealed delight at someone else's discomfort. "I'm just saying, Sage, if you're going to constantly show off in class, maybe you should consider that some of us find it really annoying," Presley was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that made insults sound like advice. Like, "We get it, you read the books. You don't have to make the rest of us look bad by always having the right answer. It's kind of try hard, you know?" Sage's face flushed. "I'm not trying to make anyone look bad. I'm just participating in class discussion. That's what we're supposed to do." "Sure, but there's participating, and then there's being extra about it." Presley examined her nails with exaggerated interest. "I'm just trying to help you out. People talk, you know. They say you're too intense, that you care too much about grades, that you don't know how to just relax and be normal." Wilder walked past them, heading toward his own locker, but he couldn't help hearing the rest of the conversation as Presley delivered her parting shot. "Maybe if you spent less time with your nose in a book and more time trying to fit in, you'd actually have some friends." The words landed with precision, and even from several feet away, Wilder could see the impact in the way Sage's shoulders curved inward, the way her hand trembled slightly as she opened her locker. Presley walked away, her boots clicking against the floor with confident rhythm, already pulling out her phone to text someone, probably to share the details of her little power play with her friends. For a moment, Wilder considered saying something. He was standing close enough that it would be natural to offer some word of commiseration, to acknowledge that Presley was cruel and wrong, that there was nothing wrong with caring about academics or having the right answer or being passionate about literature. But he remained silent, turning to his own locker instead, because getting involved meant becoming visible, meant drawing attention, meant potentially transferring target status to himself. Self-preservation won over empathy, as it had every day for 3 weeks, and he hated himself a little for it, even as he recognized the necessity. The rest of Monday followed its established pattern. Calculus in the mathematics wing, where Wilder sat in the back and worked through problems with mechanical efficiency, his answers correct, but his methodology showing none of the elegant shortcuts or intuitive leaps that might suggest mathematical talent worth noticing. Chemistry lab in the science building, where he partnered with whoever was left over after everyone else had chosen their friends, where he measured substances and recorded data with quiet competence. Lunch in the sprawling cafeteria, a space designed to accommodate 400 students across multiple levels, with high ceilings and long tables and a wall of windows overlooking the athletic fields. The cafeteria was its own ecosystem of social hierarchy. The central tables, closest to the windows with the best natural light and the most visibility, belonged to Brad Cunningham and his elite circle. Athletes, children of major donors, students whose families had buildings named after them. The surrounding tables radiated outward in descending order of social capital. The generally popular, the academically successful, the artistically inclined, the quietly average. The margins belonged to the isolated, the outcasts, the new students who hadn't yet found their place. Wilder sat alone at a small table near the emergency exit, as far from the center as possible, while still being technically in the cafeteria. His lunch was simple: a peanut butter sandwich made from generic bread, a bruised apple, a small bag of store-brand chips, all packed in a paper bag that he'd folded carefully that morning. Around him, other students ate meals purchased from the cafeteria's extensive options: Fresh salads, gourmet sandwiches, sushi prepared by an actual chef the school had hired, pizza that came from a wood-fired oven installed specifically for that purpose. The contrast was stark, deliberate, impossible to miss. "Is that really your lunch?" The voice came from above him, and Wilder looked up to find Tyler Vance standing there, his massive frame blocking out the overhead lights and casting Wilder in shadow. Tyler carried a tray loaded with food, a burger, fries, salad, 2 slices of pizza, a large soda, a parfait for dessert, enough calories for 3 people. Bro, that's sad. Like genuinely sad. The school probably has programs or something if you literally can't afford to eat. Several heads at nearby tables turned to watch the interaction. Wilder set down his sandwich carefully, his expression neutral. "I'm fine, thanks." "You sure?" "Because if you need money for lunch, I could probably spare a few bucks. I mean, I feel bad watching you eat poverty food." Tyler's tone suggested he was performing rather than offering genuine assistance, playing to an audience that was now definitely paying attention. "What is that, like welfare peanut butter?" "I appreciate the concern, but I'm good." Wilder picked up his sandwich again, took a deliberate bite, chewed slowly. His hands remained steady, his breathing even though his stomach had twisted into knots that made eating difficult. "Suit yourself, man. But seriously, that's rough." Tyler walked away, back toward the central tables where Brad and the others were watching and laughing, clearly pleased with the little show their friend had put on. Garrett raised his phone, and Wilder realized with sinking certainty that the interaction had been recorded, that it would probably appear on someone's social media by the end of lunch period, captioned with something mocking about the poor kid eating his sad sandwich alone. He forced himself to finish the meal even though it tasted like sawdust, refusing to let them see that they'd affected him, that their words had landed. Around him, the cafeteria buzzed with conversation and laughter, with the sounds of hundreds of teenagers navigating their social worlds, forming alliances and nursing grudges and falling in and out of like with the intensity that only adolescence could produce. He existed at the periphery of it all, a ghost haunting the edges of their awareness, noticed only when someone needed a target to elevate their own status. The afternoon classes passed in similar fashion. European history, where they discussed the French Revolution and the cycle of violence that followed the overthrow of the monarchy. Physical education, where Wilder deliberately underperformed during basketball drills, missing shots he could have made, avoiding the competitive intensity that might draw attention to athletic ability that shouldn't exist in someone so apparently weak and untrained. The final period was study hall in the library, a vast space of dark wood and leather chairs and endless shelves of books that smelled of paper and furniture polish, and the particular silence that libraries cultivated. Wilder claimed a desk in a far corner, hidden behind shelves of reference books that no one consulted anymore, now that everything was available online. He pulled out homework, an essay for English, problem sets for calculus, reading for history, and worked with focused intensity, his handwriting neat and compact, his answers thorough but not exceptional, maintaining the carefully constructed image of a student who was competent enough to stay enrolled, but not talented enough to warrant special notice. He'd been working for perhaps 20 minutes when he became aware of someone else in his secluded corner. Looking up, he found Sage Whitmore standing a few feet away, her arms full of books, her expression uncertain. "Sorry, I didn't realize anyone was back here," she said quietly, respecting the library's atmosphere. "I can find somewhere else." "It's fine," Wilder interrupted before she could leave. "There's room." He gestured to the other chairs at the long table, any of which she could take. The library was large enough that they didn't need to share space, but something about her presence felt less intrusive than most people's, perhaps because she seemed as intent on avoiding attention as he was. Sage hesitated, then selected a chair across from him, not directly opposite, but at an angle, leaving several feet of distance between them. She arranged her books into neat stacks, calculus, physics, French, history, and pulled out a planner that was filled with color-coded notes and carefully maintained schedules. For several minutes they worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scratch of pen on paper and the distant murmur of other students in different parts of the library. "What Presley said earlier," Sage spoke suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes still fixed on her textbook, "about me trying too hard. Do you think that's true?" The question caught Wilder off guard. He looked up from his calculus homework, studying her face, the genuine uncertainty there, the vulnerability of someone who'd been told they were wrong so many times they'd started to believe it might be true. He thought about giving her a safe answer, something non-committal that wouldn't require actual honesty or emotional investment, but something about her expression, the echo of his own internal struggles reflected in another person, made him tell the truth instead. "I think people who have never had to try hard for anything are threatened by people who do," he said carefully. "I think they call dedication try hard because they don't understand what it means to actually care about something beyond how it makes you look to other people." Sage's eyes widened slightly, and she looked directly at him for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived at Ridgemont. Really looked, seeing him as a person rather than part of the background. That's really insightful." Wilder shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's just an observation." "Still." She returned to her book, but her posture had changed, less defensive, more relaxed. "Thanks for saying that. Most people wouldn't have." They returned to their work, but something had shifted in the space between them, some small acknowledgement of recognition. Two people who didn't quite fit the Ridgemont mold, who were trying to navigate an environment that wasn't designed for them, who understood on some level what it meant to be perpetually on guard against the casual cruelty of those who'd never had to develop empathy because circumstances had never demanded it. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Wilder packed his belongings methodically, zipping his ancient backpack closed and slinging it over his shoulder. He walked out of the library to find the hallways already crowded with students heading to athletic practices, club meetings, or the parking lot where expensive cars waited in neat rows. Brad Cunningham leaned against a locker near the main exit, surrounded by his usual crowd, and his eyes locked onto Wilder as he approached. "Yo, Goodwill," Brad called out, using the nickname that had apparently stuck. "Where you headed? To your job at McDonald's? Or does someone like you work somewhere even more pathetic, like a gas station?" Wilder kept walking, not responding, but Brad stepped directly into his path, forcing him to stop or collide. The hallway traffic slowed as students sensed potential entertainment, that particular tension that preceded conflict. "I asked you a question," Brad said, his voice hardening. "It's disrespectful to ignore someone when they're talking to you. Didn't your parents teach you manners?" "Oh, wait, they probably couldn't afford etiquette lessons." "Excuse me," Wilder said quietly, attempting to move around him. Brad's hand shot out, pressing against Wilder's chest, stopping him. The physical contact was light, not quite aggressive enough to be called assault, but enough to establish dominance, to demonstrate control. "You know what I think? I think you're embarrassed. I think you're ashamed of whatever run-down apartment you live in, whatever beat-up car your family drives, if they even have a car. I think you hate that everyone here can see exactly how poor you are." The words were designed to cut, to expose and humiliate, and Wilder felt them land even as he kept his expression neutral. Behind Brad, he could see Garrett filming again, always documenting, always collecting material for later mockery. Other students watched with varying expressions, some clearly uncomfortable, others entertained, most just grateful it wasn't happening to them. "I need to go," Wilder said, his voice still quiet but with a thread of firmness woven through it. "Please move." "Or what?" Brad leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that was still loud enough for the gathered audience to hear. "What are you going to do about it, Goodwill? You going to fight me? With what? Your pathetic little noodle arms. You look like you've never thrown a punch in your life. Probably too weak from not getting enough nutrition." For just a fraction of a second, something flashed across Wilder's face. Not anger, not fear, but something harder to define, something that came and went so quickly that most people missed it entirely. His body had tensed in a way that was almost imperceptible, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet, his center of gravity dropping fractionally. But then he visibly forced himself to relax, his shoulders dropping, his stance becoming passive again. "I don't want to fight you," Wilder said simply. "Yeah, because you know you'd lose." Brad finally stepped aside, satisfied with the demonstration of power, with the way Wilder had backed down, with the footage Garrett had captured. "Run along to wherever poor kids go after school. Try not to trip over your trashy shoes on the way." Laughter followed Wilder as he walked away, pushing through the exit doors into the afternoon sunlight. The September air was warm, carrying the smell of cut grass from the athletic fields and the distant sound of the lacrosse team starting practice. He walked toward the far edge of the parking lot, where a rusty bike rack held a handful of bikes, his among them a old 10-speed with peeling paint and a squeaky chain that he'd apparently acquired from somewhere, part of his carefully constructed persona of poverty. He didn't ride the bike often, preferring to walk the 2 miles to the small apartment he supposedly rented in the less expensive part of town. The walk took him through neighborhoods that shifted in character as he moved away from Ridgemont's affluent surroundings, from gated communities with manicured lawns to modest single-family homes, to, eventually, a cluster of aging apartment buildings that housed families struggling to make rent each month. His apartment was in one of these buildings, a studio on the 3rd floor with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that clanged at night, and a window that looked out onto an alley where dumpsters overflowed with trash. The apartment was real. He paid rent every month, cash given to a landlord who didn't ask questions. He kept it sparsely furnished, a futon that served as both couch and bed, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a mini-fridge and hot plate that constituted his kitchen. No television, no computer beyond an old laptop that worked slowly, no decorations or personal items that might suggest comfort or permanence. It was a set piece, a stage where he performed the role he'd committed to, and he stayed there most nights, living the life he'd constructed. But not tonight. Tonight, after checking carefully to make sure no one had followed him, after walking an additional mile in the wrong direction and then circling back, after taking every precaution he'd learned from months of planning, Wilder made his way to where he actually lived. A car was waiting for him, discreetly parked in a public garage. A deliberately average sedan, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would contradict his cover story if anyone happened to see it. He drove for 30 minutes, leaving the modest neighborhoods behind, passing through the town center with its shops and restaurants, continuing into an area where properties were measured in acres rather than square feet, where driveways were longer than some streets, where houses weren't visible from the road behind walls and gates and carefully cultivated privacy. The gate opened automatically as he approached, sensors recognizing his vehicle. The driveway curved through landscaped grounds, past ancient trees and sculptured gardens, and a pond with a fountain, leading to a house that could more accurately be described as an estate, 3 stories of stone and glass, with wings extending from the main structure, with enough rooms that some remained unused for months at a time. Inside, the contrast to his studio apartment was absolute. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, artwork that belonged in museums, furniture that represented individual pieces costing more than most people earned in a year. He walked through rooms that echoed with emptiness despite their beauty, climbing a grand staircase to the second floor where his actual bedroom was located, a space larger than his entire studio apartment, with a bed that felt ridiculous in its comfort after the futon he'd been sleeping on, with a closet that contained clothes he hadn't worn in a month, with a bathroom that had both a tub and a separate shower and marble everything. He stood in that closet now, looking at the rows of expensive shoes, designer sneakers, Italian leather dress shoes, athletic shoes made by companies that sponsored professional athletes. His eyes lingered on a particular pair, limited edition, the kind that people waited in line for hours to purchase, that resold online for triple their already exorbitant retail price. Then he looked down at the worn canvas shoes he was still wearing, the ones that Brad had mocked, the ones that had drawn laughter and pity and disgust. "You're late." The voice came from the bedroom doorway, and Wilder turned to see his father standing there, Marcus Ashford, though he went by his middle name James in most contexts. At 53, James Ashford still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his shoulders broad beneath a tailored suit he wore even at home, his silver-streaked hair styled perfectly, his presence filling whatever room he occupied. "I expected you an hour ago." I had to be careful. I walked the wrong direction first, then doubled back. Wilder stepped out of the closet, leaving the expensive shoes behind. "Can't risk anyone following me." His father nodded, crossing the room to sit in a leather chair near the window. "How was school?" "Same as every day." Wilder sat on the edge of his bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of maintaining his performance, of being someone he wasn't, of enduring cruelty for a purpose that sometimes felt too abstract to justify the daily reality. "Brad Cunningham is escalating. So are his friends. Today they filmed me eating lunch, made a big show of offering me money for food. I'm sure it's already online somewhere. Bradford Cunningham III. His father's voice carried a particular tone when he said the name, something between contempt and disappointment. His father is on the board of trustees. Major donor. Believes his money entitles him to influence over admissions, curriculum, staffing decisions. The son has apparently learned those same values. "Why are we doing this?" Wilder asked. Not for the first time. "I could be in school with my actual name, my actual background. You could have announced you were taking over Ridgemont before I enrolled. This whole charade is necessary," his father interrupted firmly. "I've explained this, Wilder. I bought Ridgemont Academy 3 months ago because it has a stellar reputation but significant operational problems. Financial mismanagement, favoritism in admissions, a culture of entitlement that's gone unchecked for too long. Before I can fix those problems, I need to understand them from the inside. I need to see how students really behave when they think there are no consequences, how teachers respond to bullying, how administrators handle, or fail to handle, the toxic elements in the student body. And I'm your spy." There was no bitterness in Wilder's voice, just resignation. "You're my eyes," his father corrected. "You're seeing what I can't see, experiencing what the vulnerable students experience. When I officially take over as the new owner, which will be announced at the board meeting next month, I'll have first-hand knowledge of exactly what needs to change. And you'll have learned something valuable about people, about how they treat others when they believe there's no risk to themselves." Wilder didn't respond immediately. The logic made sense. Had made sense when his father first proposed this plan back in June, when the acquisition of Ridgemont had been finalized but not yet announced publicly. Wilder had agreed, partially because he understood the value of what his father was trying to accomplish, partially because he'd wanted to prove something to himself about his own character. It was easy to be kind when you had power. It was easy to have integrity when you were never tested. But what kind of person were you when stripped of advantages, when made vulnerable, when subjected to the casual cruelty of those who considered themselves superior? 1 month, his father said, reading his expression. 4 more weeks, and then the board announcement goes public. You reveal who you actually are, and we implement the changes. We establish new policies. We hold people accountable. We make it clear that Ridgemont will no longer tolerate the kind of behavior you've been documenting. And what happens to Brad, to Garrett and Tyler and all the others who've made the last 3 weeks miserable? His father's expression hardened. That depends on what they do in the next month. Right now we're observing, documenting, learning. When I officially take over, we'll be acting. Students who've created hostile environments will face real consequences. Teachers who've looked the other way will answer for their negligence. The entire culture will shift because it will have to. The alternative will be expulsion, termination, fundamental change in their relationship with the school. Wilder nodded slowly, accepting the timeline, even though 4 more weeks felt like an eternity when measured in daily humiliations. There's a girl, he said after a moment. Sage Whitmore. She's smart, really smart, and they target her for it. She doesn't have what they have, the social connections, the built-in friend groups, but she tries so hard, and they mock her for caring. Is she being bullied to the same extent you are? No. It's more subtle with her. Exclusion, belittling, that kind of psychological warfare that doesn't leave visible marks. He thought about the conversation between Sage and Presley, about the tremor in Sage's hand as she'd opened her locker. But it's still damaging. His father pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind he always carried, and made a note. I'll make sure her situation is addressed in the review. Anyone who's made to feel unwelcome or inadequate because they're academically serious, that's exactly the kind of attitude we're going to eliminate. They talked for another hour, Wilder providing detailed accounts of the day's events, his father asking specific questions about teachers' responses, about whether administrators had been present during any of the incidents, about the social dynamics he'd observed in different contexts. It felt clinical, almost anthropological, reducing his lived experience to data points in a larger analysis. But that distance also helped, made it feel less personal, less like he was a victim, and more like he was conducting research. Eventually, Wilder returned to his studio apartment, driving the unremarkable sedan back through darkening streets, parking in the public garage, walking the final blocks to his building. He climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled of old cooking and mildew, unlocked his door, and entered the cramped space that served as his public home. The futon was uncomfortable after his actual bed. The silence was oppressive, without the familiar sounds of the estate. But this was the life he'd committed to living, at least for 4 more weeks. That night, lying in the dark and listening to the radiator clang, Wilder thought about Brad Cunningham's face, about the satisfaction he'd seen there when delivering his casual cruelties. He thought about Garrett's phone, always recording, always capturing moments of other people's degradation for entertainment. He thought about Tyler's bulk, his willingness to use physical intimidation even when unnecessary. And he thought about his father's plan, about the reckoning that was coming, about what it would feel like to watch understanding dawn on Brad's face when he realized who Wilder actually was, who held real power in this situation. The temptation to fantasize about that moment was strong. To imagine Brad's humiliation, his fear, his desperate backpedaling when roles reversed, and he found himself at the mercy of someone he'd tormented. But Wilder forced himself away from those thoughts, back toward the reason he'd agreed to this experiment in the first place. It wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding what allowed people like Brad to flourish, what systems and attitudes enabled cruelty, what changes were necessary to build a school culture where students felt safe, regardless of their financial background or social status. Still, as he finally drifted towards sleep, He couldn't entirely suppress a small flicker of anticipation for the day when the truth would come out, when the power dynamic would shift, when Brad would have to confront exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. Tuesday morning arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of New England weather that made everything feel damp and chilled. Wilder walked to Ridgemont, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the weather, his worn shoes leaving wet footprints on the marble floor as he entered the building. The morning routine had become familiar enough to execute on autopilot, locker, textbooks, first period. But today, something felt different in the atmosphere, a particular tension in the way students looked at him, in the whispers that followed his progress through the hallways. The reason became clear when he opened his locker and found his phone. An old model, deliberately chosen for this role, had several notifications from social media platforms he barely used. Someone had tagged him, or rather had tagged at Ridgemont Goodwill, the mocking handle that had apparently been created specifically to reference him. He opened the notifications with dread settling in his stomach, already knowing what he'd find. The video from yesterday's lunch was there, posted to multiple platforms with captions like, "When you can't even afford school lunch," and "Poverty meal at Ridgemont," and "This is what scholarship students eat while we get sushi." Tyler's voice was clearly audible, offering fake sympathy, and the video had been edited to zoom in on Wilder's paper bag lunch, on his bruised apple, on the generic peanut butter sandwich that suddenly represented everything about class division and social hierarchy, and the casual cruelty of those who'd never known want. The comments were worse than the video itself. Hundreds of them, from Ridgemont students and their friends at other schools, ranging from false sympathy to outright mockery, to suggestions about what Wilder should do if he couldn't afford to attend Ridgemont. Some students had created memes using screenshots from the video, captioning them with jokes about food stamps and welfare and poverty that demonstrated a stunning lack of awareness about how most people actually lived. Wilder closed his phone, his jaw tight, his hands steady, despite the rush of humiliation and anger that threatened to break through his carefully maintained composure. This was new territory. The bullying had been direct and personal before, confined to in-person interactions, but now it had metastasized across social media, had become a collective activity, had invited hundreds of people to participate in his degradation from the safety of their screens. "Yo, you're famous!" The voice belonged to Garrett, who'd appeared beside him with Brad and Tyler in tow, all three of them grinning with the satisfaction of a successful campaign. "That video has like 5,000 views already. You're trending in the local social media ecosystem. Congratulations on your viral moment." Wilder closed his locker without responding, preparing to walk away, but Brad stepped into his path with practiced ease. "We're just trying to help, actually," Brad said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Like, if we can raise awareness about how hard it is for poor students at schools like Ridgemont, maybe the administration will do something about it. Maybe they'll add better scholarship programs, free lunch options, that kind of thing. You should be thanking us for advocacy." The logic was so twisted, so deliberately cruel in its mockery of actual social justice language that Wilder felt something shift inside him, not breaking, but bending, straining against the promise he'd made to stay passive, to document but not react, to endure until his father's plan reached its conclusion. "I have class," Wilder said, his voice tight. "Yeah, you do. You have class in being poor." Garrett laughed at his own wordplay, and Tyler joined in with his rumbling chuckle, the three of them feeding off each other's energy, escalating because they could, because no teacher was in sight, because the students passing by either looked away or watched with phones raised to capture whatever happened next. Wilder walked away, forcing his breathing to remain even, forcing his hands to stay loose at his sides, forcing every muscle in his body not to respond the way they'd been trained to respond to threats, to aggression, to people who positioned themselves as dominant through intimidation. He'd trained in Brazilian jiu-jitsu since he was 7, had earned his black belt at 16, had spent hundreds of hours on mats, learning how to neutralize opponents through leverage and technique rather than strength. He'd cross-trained in boxing and Muay Thai, learning striking arts to complement his grappling, developing the ability to handle himself in virtually any physical confrontation. His father had insisted on the training, believing that people of privilege had a responsibility to be capable of protecting themselves and others, that power should be accompanied by the ability to use it wisely. But he'd also learned from his instructors, from his father, from his own observations of the world, that the highest expression of martial skill was not using it. That true strength meant being capable of violence but choosing peace. That winning a fight with someone like Brad Cunningham would accomplish nothing beyond momentary satisfaction, would change nothing about the underlying attitudes and systems that enabled such behavior in the first place. So he walked away, again, as he had every day for 3 weeks, carrying the weight of humiliation and the burden of restraint, reminding himself that 4 more weeks wasn't forever, that documentation would lead to justice, that playing the long game meant accepting short-term losses. American literature passed in a blur of discussion about The Great Gatsby that Wilder couldn't focus on, his mind replaying the video, calculating how many people had seen it by now, imagining the conversations happening in other classrooms about the poor kid who ate pathetic lunches. Mrs. Patterson called on him once, asking about Nick Carraway's reliability as a narrator, and Wilder provided an adequate answer about how Nick's Midwestern values colored his interpretation of East Coast excess, but his heart wasn't in the analysis. Sage Whitmore glanced back at him once during class, her expression concerned, and he realized she must have seen the video too. The thought of her watching his humiliation made something twist in his chest, though he couldn't articulate exactly why her witness felt more significant than the thousands of others. When the bell rang, Sage lingered by her desk, letting other students file out until the room was mostly empty. She approached Wilder as he packed his bag, her movements hesitant, clearly uncertain about whether her intervention would be welcome. "I saw the video," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. It's really cruel, what they did." "It's fine," Wilder said automatically, the reflexive response he'd been giving to everything, the deflection that had become his default. "It's not fine." Sage's voice was firmer now, more definite. "None of this is fine. The way they treat you, the way everyone just watches, it's not fine, and you don't have to pretend it is." Wilder looked at her directly, really looked, seeing someone who understood something about what he was experiencing, who was angry on his behalf in a way that nobody else had been. "Did you comment on the video?" "I reported it," she said, "on every platform I found it. For bullying, harassment, everything I could think of. I doubt it'll get taken down, nothing ever does. But I had to do something." The gesture was small, probably meaningless in the grand scheme of algorithmic content moderation, but it meant something to Wilder in that moment. Someone had stood up, even in a minor way, even knowing it wouldn't change anything. Someone had seen cruelty and responded with action rather than apathy. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. They walked out of the classroom together, falling into step naturally, even though they were heading in different directions. The hallway had mostly cleared as students scattered to second period, giving them a brief window of relative privacy. "Why do you let them do it?" Sage asked after a moment of silence. "I'm not saying you should fight back or anything, but you could at least report them to administration. Tell your parents, something." Wilder considered his response carefully, weighing truth against cover story. Sometimes fighting back just makes things worse. Sometimes the best strategy is to endure until circumstances change. "That's really sad," Sage said softly. "You shouldn't have to endure being treated like that." "What about you?" Wilder turned the question back on her. "Why do you let Presley and her friends talk to you that way? Why not report them?" Sage's expression shifted, acknowledging the validity of his point. "Because it's complicated. Because reporting makes you a target in different ways. Because the administration cares more about maintaining the school's reputation than actually addressing problems." She paused, then added, "Because sometimes it feels like suffering in silence is the only option available." They'd reached the point where their paths diverged. Sage toward calculus in one direction, Wilder toward chemistry in another. But neither moved immediately, both recognizing something in the other that felt like understanding, like kinship formed in shared experience of existing outside the protective circle of privilege and power. "We should probably stick together," Sage said finally. "I don't mean like date or anything weird." She flushed, clearly embarrassed by her own awkwardness. "I just mean two people who are being targeted have a better chance than one person alone. Safety in numbers or something." Wilder felt the corners of his mouth twitch, almost smiling despite everything. "Are you asking to be my friend?" "I'm suggesting a strategic alliance," Sage corrected, but her own lips curved slightly. "Friends might be a side effect of the alliance." "Okay." Wilder extended his hand formally, and after a moment's hesitation, Sage shook it. "Strategic alliance formed." "Great." She turned to leave, then looked back. "Hey, Wilder, for what it's worth, I think you're handling all of this with a lot of grace. More than most people would." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the hallway with an odd feeling in his chest, something warmer than he'd experienced in weeks, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The rest of Tuesday and all of Wednesday followed predictable patterns. The video continued to circulate, accumulating views and comments and shares, becoming a minor sensation in the ecosystem of teenage social media. Brad and his friends rode the wave of attention, basking in their successful humiliation of a target who couldn't fight back. Teachers who must have been aware of the video's existence said nothing, did nothing, maintained their careful distance from student social dynamics that fell outside explicit school policy violations, but something had shifted with Sage's alliance. They sat together at lunch now, two social outcasts claiming a small table and creating their own space, separate from the cafeteria's hierarchical seating arrangement. They studied together in the library, quizzing each other on vocabulary and historical dates and mathematical formulas. They walked between classes when their schedules aligned, their conversations ranging from academic topics to broader philosophical discussions about fairness and justice and what responsibility people had to intervene when they witnessed cruelty. Wilder found himself genuinely enjoying her company, appreciating her sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor, the way she could discuss complicated ethical questions without reducing them to simple answers. She made the days bearable in a way they hadn't been before, gave him something to look forward to beyond simply surviving until the next weekend. Of course, Brad noticed. Thursday afternoon in the cafeteria, Wilder and Sage were discussing an upcoming history exam, testing each other on the causes and effects of various European wars, when Brad's voice carried across from the central tables. "Looks like Goodwill found himself a girlfriend." The announcement silenced surrounding conversations, drew attention from across the room. "Guess poverty loves company. They can go on dates to the dollar store, split a value menu meal at McDonald's." Laughter rippled through the cafeteria, and Wilder felt Sage tense across from him. Her face had gone pale, her hands gripping her fork too tightly, her whole body rigid with the awareness that she'd just been pulled into the spotlight in the most humiliating way possible. "Don't react," Wilder said quietly. "That's what they want." But Brad wasn't finished. He'd stood up from his table now, carrying his tray over toward where Wilder and Sage sat, Tyler and Garrett flanking him like presidential security detail. They positioned themselves around the small table, creating a circle of intimidation, blocking escape routes. "I'm actually curious," Brad said, leaning against a nearby chair, his posture deliberately casual, but his eyes sharp. "What do you two talk about? Comparing notes on being losers? Sharing tips on how to be social rejects? Or maybe you're planning the saddest prom proposal in Ridgemont history. Will you ask her with a ring pop since you can't afford a real ring?" "Leave us alone, Brad." Sage's voice was quieter than Wilder had ever heard it, small and uncertain, and he realized with a sharp pang of guilt that his association had made her a more prominent target, had transferred some of the heat he'd been absorbing onto her. "Oh, she speaks." Brad affected exaggerated surprise. "I thought maybe Goodwill here had paid you to sit with him, like hired you to pretend he's not completely friendless. How much does he pay per lunch period? Minimum wage? Less, since you're just sitting here, not actually doing anything." "We're having a private conversation," Wilder said, his voice level but with steel underneath. "You're not part of it." "I'm making it public," Brad countered. "See, this is a teachable moment. I want everyone to understand what happens when people who don't belong at Ridgemont try to form their sad little support groups. It's pathetic, and it drags down the whole school's reputation. The only thing dragging down the school's reputation is you." The words came from Sage, whose fear had apparently transmuted into anger, her voice growing stronger. "You're cruel for no reason except that you can be, because you've never faced real consequences for anything in your entire life." Brad's expression darkened, his casual mockery shifting to something uglier. "Careful, Sage. You're already on thin ice socially. Keep running your mouth and you'll find out exactly how much worse things can get for you here." "Is that a threat?" Sage stood up now, her chair scraping against the floor, her whole body vibrating with suppressed emotion. "Are you actually threatening me because I called out your behavior?" "I'm stating facts." Brad leaned closer, invading her personal space, using his height advantage to intimidate. "Facts like, you're a nobody. Facts like, nobody here actually likes you, they just tolerate you. Facts like, even teachers think you're annoying with your constant hand-raising and try-hard attitude. You're only at Ridgemont because you test well, not because you actually fit here. And if you keep making noise, if you keep embarrassing yourself by associating with literal charity cases like Goodwill here, people are going to make sure you understand just how unwelcome you really are." Something snapped in Wilder's chest. Not his control, not yet, but something that had been bending under pressure for 3 weeks straight. He stood up smoothly, his movement controlled and economical, placing himself slightly between Brad and Sage, shifting the geometry of their positions. "Step back," Wilder said quietly. Brad laughed, surprised by the directive. "Or what?" "What are you going to do about it, Goodwill?" "I'm asking politely. Step back." There was something different in Wilder's voice now, a quality that hadn't been there before, something that made Brad hesitate despite himself. For a long moment, they stood there in tableau. Brad and his friends surrounding the table, Wilder and Sage standing their ground, the rest of the cafeteria watching with held breath to see what would happen next. Then, Garrett's hand landed on Wilder's shoulder, gripping it in a way that was meant to hurt, meant to establish physical dominance. "Brad told you to know your place. Maybe you need help remembering—" He didn't finish the sentence. Wilder's hand had moved, not dramatically, not with flourish, just an economical motion that controlled Garrett's wrist, redirected the force of his grip, and left him stumbling backward with a surprised expression. It happened so quickly that most people couldn't process exactly what they'd seen, just that Garrett had been touching Wilder and now wasn't, had been positioned above him and now wasn't, had been in control and now was off balance and confused. "Don't touch me again," Wilder said simply. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Hundreds of students frozen in their seats, everyone's attention locked onto the confrontation. Even Brad looked momentarily uncertain, his cocky expression flickering as he recalculated whatever assumptions he'd made about Wilder's complete helplessness. But Tyler, operating on instinct and loyalty rather than thought, moved forward with his considerable bulk, reaching to grab Wilder with both hands. What happened next was even faster than the interaction with Garrett. Wilder stepped offline from the reaching hands, moved into Tyler's space rather than away from it, and did something with his positioning and balance that sent Tyler stumbling past him, carried forward by his own momentum, nearly colliding with a nearby table. Now everyone was staring. Now phones were out recording. Now the energy in the room had shifted from anticipated humiliation of the weak to something else entirely. Confusion, shock, the first stirrings of recognition that whatever they'd assumed about Wilder Ashford was wrong. "We're going to the library," Wilder said to Sage, his voice calm despite the adrenaline he must have been feeling. "Are you coming?" Sage nodded mutely, gathering her things with shaking hands. They walked toward the cafeteria exit, and the crowd of students parted to let them through, creating a path that felt almost ceremonial. Behind them, Brad's voice rang out, "This isn't over! You don't get to just walk away." But it sounded hollow now, the threat of someone who'd lost control of a situation they'd thought they commanded. They didn't speak until they'd reached the library, finding their usual corner behind the reference shelves. Sage sank into a chair, her face pale, her hands still trembling. "What was that? What did you do to them?" "Redirected," Wilder said carefully. "They grabbed me. I moved their energy away from where they wanted it to go." "That's not—" Sage stopped, studying his face with new awareness. "You've trained in martial arts or something. That wasn't just random luck." Wilder didn't confirm or deny, settling into the chair across from her. "I didn't hurt anyone. I just didn't let them hurt me." "But you could have." It wasn't a question. "You could have actually hurt them if you'd wanted to." "That's what I saw, right? Not just defense, but capability. I don't want to hurt anyone." Wilder's voice was firm. "I want to finish this year without becoming the kind of person they are, someone who uses their advantages to dominate others." Sage absorbed this, processing implications. "Why didn't you do that before? Why wait until now to show you could handle yourself?" "Because showing it earlier wouldn't have served any purpose except escalation. Because I'm trying to get through this with as little conflict as possible." He paused, then added, "And because you were there. Because he was threatening you, and I couldn't just stand by and let that happen." Something passed across Sage's face, surprise maybe, or gratitude, or something more complicated. "I can take care of myself." "I know you can. But you shouldn't have to, not alone." Wilder leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "What I did out there, that's going to make everything worse. You understand that, right? Brad's ego is wounded. He'll escalate to restore his dominance. This isn't over." "Good," Sage said, surprising him. "I'm tired of them getting away with everything. I'm tired of being scared. If they escalate, at least that means things are changing, that someone finally pushed back." They sat in their corner for the rest of lunch period, not discussing what had happened, not analyzing strategies, just existing in each other's presence while processing the fundamental shift that had occurred. When the bell rang for fifth period, they packed their belongings slowly, both aware that walking back into the regular flow of school meant facing whatever consequences would follow their cafeteria confrontation. The rest of Thursday passed in a strange atmosphere of whispered speculation. Students who'd never looked at Wilder before now watched him in hallways, their expressions ranging from curiosity to nervousness to respect. The video from lunch had already started circulating. Not surprising, given how many phones had been recording, but the footage was confusing to most viewers. It showed Tyler and Garrett stumbling, showed Wilder remaining calm, but it didn't clearly capture the actual techniques he'd used, making it look like his opponents had simply been clumsy or incompetent. Brad's crew conspicuously avoided him for the rest of the day, and Wilder knew that meant they were regrouping, planning, preparing for some kind of retaliation that would allow Brad to reassert his dominance and restore the social order that had been disrupted. Friday morning, Wilder approached Ridgemont with heightened awareness, scanning his surroundings for potential threats or ambushes, but the day progressed normally, or as normally as possible, given the stares and whispers that followed him everywhere. Brad and his friends kept their distance, content with glares and muttered comments, but no direct confrontation. Sage stayed close, her presence both comforting and worrying, since Wilder knew his association had marked her as a target in ways that would persist even after his own situation eventually resolved. The weekend provided temporary respite. Wilder returned to his father's estate on Friday evening, shedding the persona of poverty like removing an uncomfortable costume. He recounted the week's events in detail. The viral video, his alliance with Sage, the cafeteria confrontation, where he'd allowed glimpses of his actual capabilities to show through. His father listened intently, making notes, asking questions. "You're approaching the tipping point," he observed. "The situation is intensifying, and your opponents are feeling threatened. The next week will be critical. They'll either back down or escalate dramatically." "They'll escalate," Wilder said with certainty. "Brad Cunningham doesn't back down. His entire identity is built on being untouchable, dominant. I challenge that in front of the entire school. He can't let it stand. Then we'll document what happens next, and we'll use it as evidence when we implement changes." His father's expression was grim. "I don't like seeing you in harm's way, but you're learning things about human nature that no classroom could teach, about how power corrupts when unchecked, about how institutions fail when leadership prioritizes reputation over justice, about how silence enables cruelty." Wilder spent the weekend training, not because he needed the physical practice, but because the movement helped him process stress, helped him reconnect with discipline and control after days of maintaining passive submission. His instructor, Master Chen, pushed him through advanced combinations, rolling sessions that tested his technique against opponents who didn't hold back, striking drills that demanded precision and power. The work was exhausting and clarifying, reminding him of who he was beneath the mask he'd been wearing, what he was capable of when circumstances demanded it. Sunday evening, as he prepared to return to his studio apartment, his father stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. 3 more weeks, he said, 21 days, and then the board announcement. Can you endure 21 more days? Wilder thought about Brad's wounded pride, about the retaliation that was certainly coming, about the cost of maintaining his cover story when everything in him wanted to reveal the truth and watch the social hierarchy crumble. But he also thought about what his father was building, about the lasting changes that would come from this documentation, about the future students who wouldn't have to experience what he'd been experiencing because policies would be different, accountability would be real, culture would shift. 21 days, he agreed. I can do 21 days. But Monday morning brought a development he hadn't anticipated. He walked into Ridgemont to find students clustering around their phones, gathered in small groups, their expressions ranging from shock to delight to something that looked like concern. When they saw him approaching, many looked up with new interest, some even greeting him by name, his actual name, not the mocking goodwill nickname. Confused, Wilder made his way to his locker, where he found Sage already waiting, her own phone in her hand, her expression complicated. "You need to see this," she said, turning her screen toward him. It was a social media post from an account called @RidgemontTruth, created sometime over the weekend. The post was extensive, detailed, and devastating. Let's talk about Brad Cunningham III and his crew. Let's talk about how they've been systematically bullying a new student for weeks. Let's talk about the videos they've made mocking someone for being poor. Let's talk about how teachers and administrators have watched it happen and done nothing. Let's talk about how toxic the culture at Ridgemont has become, where students feel entitled to cruelty because they've never faced consequences. This thread will document everything: screenshots, videos, testimonies, time for accountability. The thread that followed was meticulous, presenting evidence in chronological order: the lunch video, screenshots of cruel comments, footage of hallway confrontations, statements from anonymous students about their own experiences with Brad's bullying. It named names, cited specific incidents, and called out the institutional failure to address known problems. Within hours, the post had gone viral far beyond Ridgemont's small social media ecosystem. Parents were commenting, demanding explanations. Alumni were expressing outrage about what the school had become. Local media had picked up the story, with reporters calling the administration for statements about bullying culture and accountability measures. Who did this? Wilder asked, though he had suspicions. I don't know, Sage said, but her expression suggested maybe she did. Maybe she'd had something to do with it. Maybe she'd spent her weekend compiling evidence and creating an account and deciding that silence wasn't working, so it was time for noise. The effect on Ridgemont's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. By third period, Brad Cunningham had been called to the principal's office along with Garrett, Tyler, and several others whose names appeared in the @RidgemontTruth thread. By lunch, rumors were circulating that parents had been contacted, that suspensions were being discussed, that the Board of Trustees had called an emergency meeting to address the public relations crisis that was unfolding in real time. Students who'd previously ignored Wilder's treatment now approached to apologize, to express regret for their silence, to explain that they'd wanted to help, but hadn't known how. He accepted their apologies with grace, recognizing that many of them were genuine, even if motivated by the fear of being associated with the exposed behavior. Sage ate lunch with him again, though now they were joined by several other students. Quiet, thoughtful people who'd existed on the margins of Ridgemont's social hierarchy, who saw in the @RidgemontTruth exposure an opportunity to maybe, possibly, create something different. They talked about what a better school culture might look like, what policies could be implemented, what role students themselves could play in maintaining accountability. It felt like hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. Brad reappeared in the hallways that afternoon, his face darker than Wilder had ever seen it, his movements tight with barely controlled rage. Their eyes met once across the crowded corridor, and Wilder saw promise there. Not acceptance, not defeat, but determination to restore order through whatever means necessary. The official consequences hadn't materialized yet beyond temporary removal from classes, and until they did, Brad clearly felt he still had power to wield. That evening, Wilder received a text message from an unknown number. Tuesday after school. Parking lot. We're going to settle this. He showed the message to Sage, who'd given him her number over the weekend, who'd become something more than a strategic alliance partner, something that felt like genuine friendship, and maybe, eventually, something beyond that. Don't go, she said immediately. It's obviously a setup. They're going to jump you or record you or something. If I don't go, it proves I'm scared. It gives him exactly what he wants. The narrative that I only looked capable in the cafeteria because of luck, or because I caught them off guard. Wilder stared at his phone, thinking through options. But if I do go, If I handle whatever they plan with the same control I showed in the cafeteria, maybe that's what finally ends this. Maybe that's what makes them understand they can't win through intimidation anymore. Or maybe you get hurt. Sage's voice was sharp with worry. Or maybe you hurt one of them, and then you're the one facing consequences, even though they started everything. I won't hurt anyone, Wilder promised. That's not who I am. Tuesday morning, he told his father about the message, about the challenge. His father's first instinct was to intervene, to call the school, to alert authorities, to use his still private position as the new owner to shut down whatever Brad was planning. But Wilder argued against it. This is the culmination, he said. This is the moment where everything comes together. Brad is going to bring his friends, probably some others for backup. He's going to try to humiliate me one final time, to restore his dominance. And I'm going to show exactly who I am, not by beating them up, not by becoming the violent person they want to make me, but by demonstrating that their attempts at intimidation have no power anymore. It's risky, his father warned. Everything about this has been risky. But in 2 weeks, you're announcing your ownership. In 2 weeks, major changes are being implemented. This confrontation, whatever happens, it's the last chapter before the entire book rewrites itself. His father studied him for a long moment, seeing something in Wilder's expression that made him finally nod. All right, but I'm calling security to be nearby, discreetly positioned. If things go truly wrong, they'll intervene. Tuesday passed in a haze of anticipation and anxiety. Classes happened around Wilder, but he absorbed little of their content. His mind focused on the afternoon, on the parking lot, on whatever Brad had planned. Sage stuck close, clearly worried, trying to convince him to reconsider, even as she understood he wouldn't. "At least let me be there," she said during lunch. "Someone who can call for help if needed, who can be a witness. You're already too involved. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Too late. I'm already hurt because of you, hurt by caring about what happens to you, hurt by being invested in how this turns out. So I might as well actually be there. Her expression was determined, brooking no argument. Besides, I'm the one who created the @Ridgemont Truth account. I'm the one who exposed them publicly. If they're mad at anyone, they should be mad at me. Wilder stared at her, processing this confirmation of what he'd suspected. "You did that for me." "I did it for both of us. For everyone who's ever been targeted by people like Brad. For the principle that cruelty shouldn't go unchallenged." She reached across the table, taking his hand briefly. "And yes, I did it for you. Because you didn't deserve what they were doing, and someone needed to shine a light on it." That afternoon, when final period ended and students streamed toward the parking lot, Wilder and Sage walked together into what felt like a showdown. The parking lot was sprawling, able to accommodate hundreds of vehicles, divided into sections for students, faculty, and visitors. Brad had specified the far corner, away from main exits, where supervision was minimal and witnesses would have to deliberately choose to gather. A crowd was already forming when they arrived, perhaps 50 students, maybe more, drawn by texts and social media posts that something was happening, that the conflict between Brad and Wilder was reaching its conclusion. Brad stood in the center of the space, flanked by Tyler and Garrett, with 4 other students Wilder recognized as part of their extended circle. 8 against 1, or 8 against 2, if Sage counted as part of the opposition. Brad's expression was savage satisfaction mixed with barely contained fury. "Goodwill. You actually showed up. I'm impressed. Usually rats hide when they know there's danger." Wilder walked forward slowly, Sage beside him despite his earlier objections to her presence, until they stood about 10 feet from Brad's group. The crowd had formed a loose circle around them, phones out, everyone recording, creating a digital coliseum for whatever was about to happen. "What do you want, Brad? Wilder kept his voice level, his posture relaxed but balanced, weight distributed evenly, ready to move in any direction if needed. I want you to understand your place. Brad began walking around Wilder in a slow circle, predator stalking prey, playing to the audience. I want everyone here to see what happens when people who don't belong at Ridgemont try to rise above their station. I want to show you what real power looks like, not whatever lucky moves you pulled in the cafeteria, but actual dominance. And you need 7 friends to help you demonstrate that? Wilder turned slowly, keeping Brad in his field of vision, aware of the others who might flank or surround him. That doesn't seem like dominance. That seems like fear. Brad's face flushed with rage. I'm not afraid of you. I'm just making sure you're completely humiliated before you eventually transfer out or drop out or whatever happens to people who can't afford to be here. Actually, I think we need to talk about something. Wilder's voice carried across the parking lot, loud enough for everyone to hear. About who can actually afford to be here. About what power really means. About who's going to be making decisions about Ridgemont's future. Brad laughed, though it sounded forced. What are you babbling about? You think anyone cares about your poor person philosophy? I think everyone should know the truth. Wilder pulled out his phone, pulling up a document his father had sent him that morning. Authorization for precisely this moment. My full name is Wilder James Ashford. My father is Marcus James Ashford, who acquired Ridgemont Academy 3 months ago through Ashford Educational Holdings. In 2 weeks, at the next board meeting, his ownership will be announced publicly, along with major administrative and cultural changes. The silence that fell over the parking lot was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the wind in the trees at the campus edge. Students stared at their phones, some Googling the name Ashford Educational Holdings, others pulling up news articles about the acquisition that had been public record but not widely discussed. Brad's expressions cycled through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he pulled out his own phone, searching, finding verification of what Wilder had just claimed. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. You're lying, he said, but his voice was weak, uncertain. I'm not. Wilder turned slowly, addressing the entire assembled crowd. My father asked me to transfer in quietly, to experience Ridgemont as a regular student, to see what the culture was really like before he implemented changes. He wanted to understand how students treated each other when they thought there would be no consequences, how teachers responded to bullying, how administrators prioritized reputation over student welfare, and you all provided that information perfectly. This is bullshit. Brad started forward aggressively, but Wilder's phone buzzed with a message. He looked at it, then smiled. Actually, if you all turn around, you'll see it's not. The crowd turned collectively toward the main parking lot entrance, where a vehicle was pulling in, not the unremarkable sedan Wilder had been driving, but a black Range Rover with pristine paint and windows tinted dark enough to suggest privacy and wealth. The vehicle parked nearby, and Marcus James Ashford stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. He walked toward the gathered students, and the crowd parted instinctively, recognizing authority even before understanding exactly who they were seeing. He reached Wilder's side, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that was both paternal and proprietary. Bradford Cunningham III, Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the space. Your father is on the board of trustees, or was, I should say, until his resignation was accepted yesterday, after we discussed his son's behavior and his own failure to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal interests and institutional governance. You've been documented engaging in systematic harassment, cyberbullying, and today organizing what appears to be an attempt at physical intimidation involving multiple students against one. Brad looked like he might vomit or pass out, his carefully constructed world collapsing in real time as he understood exactly how wrong he'd been about everything, how completely the power dynamic had inverted. "The administration has been making decisions about your future at Ridgemont," Marcus continued. "Given the documented behavior, the public attention that's now focusing on the school, and the need to demonstrate that we take these matters seriously, you're expelled, effective immediately. So are several of your associates." He gestured toward Tyler and Garrett. "Your parents have been notified and are being required to pick you up from campus within the hour." "You can't," Brad started, but Marcus cut him off with a look. "I can, and I have. Additionally, the content you created targeting my son will be addressed through appropriate legal channels. Defamation, harassment, cyberbullying. Our attorneys are reviewing everything for potential civil action." The crowd of students stood in stunned silence, watching one of Ridgemont's most powerful figures reduced to powerlessness in a matter of minutes. Some looked satisfied, vindicated by seeing justice enacted. Others looked nervous, realizing that if Brad could fall this completely, their own positions were less secure than they'd imagined. Marcus turned to address the broader group. "In 2 weeks, major changes will be announced. New anti-bullying policies with actual enforcement mechanisms, mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and addressing harassment, a revised code of conduct that emphasizes character and community over social status and financial contribution, anonymous reporting systems that will be taken seriously. Ridgemont's culture is going to change, fundamentally, starting now." He walked back toward his vehicle but paused before leaving. "Wilder, you can ride home with me. We should talk." But Wilder shook his head. "Actually, I think I should stay. There are conversations I need to have." His father studied him for a moment, then nodded with understanding. The Range Rover departed, leaving Wilder standing in the parking lot, the center of attention in a completely different way than before. Brad and his crew were escorted from the premises by security, their removal marking the definitive end of their reign. The remaining students dispersed slowly, processing what they'd witnessed, the fundamental restructuring of social reality that had occurred in the span of 20 minutes. Sage remained, her expression complex, relief, satisfaction, concern, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "So you're actually the heir to a fortune. You're actually the son of the man who now owns the school." "I am." Wilder felt suddenly exhausted, the weight of maintaining deception for weeks finally lifting. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you earlier. My father made me promise to keep it secret until the official announcement. You let them humiliate you. You let them treat you like trash, mock you for being poor, post those videos, all while knowing you had the power to stop it at any time." Sage's voice was quiet, difficult to read. "That was either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave. I haven't decided which. Probably both." Wilder attempted a smile. "I wanted to understand what it was like for students who actually don't have resources, who actually are vulnerable. I wanted my father to have real information about how the culture worked when implementing changes. And," he paused, uncertain if he should admit this, "I wanted to prove something to myself about who I am when I don't have advantages, when I'm genuinely tested." "And what did you prove?" "That I can endure, that I can stay true to values even when it costs me, that I don't need to become cruel or violent to maintain my self-respect." He looked directly at her. "And that some things, some people, are worth protecting even when you've promised to stay passive." Sage's expression softened. "You mean when I was being threatened in the cafeteria? I mean every interaction we've had. You made this bearable, Sage. You gave me something real when everything else was performance." They stood in the emptying parking lot, the sun beginning its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the pavement. Around them, Ridgemont Academy continued its daily rhythms, but everything had changed in fundamental ways that would take time to fully understand. "So what happens now?" Sage asked. "Do you transfer back to whatever elite private school you attended before? Do you disappear into your wealthy life and leave us regular students to deal with the aftermath?" "I stay." Wilder's answer was immediate, certain. "I finish the year here. My father's changes will take time to implement, and I want to be part of making sure they actually work. Besides," he gestured around the campus, "this is where my friends are now." "Friends, plural?" Sage raised an eyebrow. "Friend, singular." He smiled, genuine this time. "One very good friend who stood by me when she had no reason to, who risked her own social standing to create that truth account, who's smarter and braver than she probably realizes." Sage looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment, but also pleased. "I should warn you that befriending me is probably social suicide. Even with your father owning the school, I'm still fundamentally uncool. Good thing I don't care about being cool." Wilder started walking toward the main building, and Sage fell into step beside him. "I care about being decent, and finding other people who care about the same thing." The next 2 weeks were transformative for Ridgemont Academy. Marcus Ashford's ownership was announced officially at a board meeting that became front-page news in local papers, particularly given the context of the recent bullying scandals. Several long-time board members resigned alongside Cunningham, their departures signaling a genuine shift in institutional priorities. New policies were drafted with input from students, teachers, and child psychology experts, creating frameworks for addressing harassment that emphasized education and reconciliation over purely punitive measures while still maintaining consequences for serious violations. Brad Cunningham transferred to a school in another state, his family eager to escape the public embarrassment of their son's expulsion and their father's forced resignation from the board. Tyler and Garrett faced similar outcomes, their families scrambling to manage the reputational damage while their sons learned belatedly about accountability. Other students who'd participated in harassment faced suspensions, mandatory counseling, and close monitoring of their behavior going forward. But perhaps more significant than any individual punishment was the cultural shift that rippled through Ridgemont's halls. Students who'd been silent bystanders began speaking up when they witnessed cruelty. Teachers who'd previously avoided involvement became more willing to intervene, empowered by administrative support that hadn't existed before. The social hierarchy that had seemed so permanent began to fracture and reform along different lines. Not wealth or athletic prowess or family legacy, but character and kindness and the courage to stand up for others. Wilder moved back into his studio apartment permanently, not as a disguise now, but as a statement, a reminder to himself and others about what mattered, about the trap of letting privilege distance you from understanding how most people actually lived. His father approved, seeing it as evidence that the experiment had taught exactly what it was intended to teach. Sage and Wilder's friendship deepened naturally, evolving through shared lunches and study sessions and conversations that ranged from philosophy to physics to their favorite terrible movies. They became fixtures in each other's lives, two people who'd found each other during the worst and emerged with something neither had expected, genuine connection, built not on shared interests or social convenience, but on mutual respect, forged in adversity. 3 months after Brad's expulsion, on a cold December afternoon when snow dusted Ridgemont's grounds with crystalline beauty, Wilder and Sage sat in the library's far corner, their corner now claimed through habit and preference. They were ostensibly studying for midterm exams, but the conversation had drifted away from academic topics toward more philosophical territory. "Do you ever regret it?" Sage asked, her pen tapping against her textbook. "The way you handled everything with Brad? Not revealing who you were sooner, not using your father's power earlier?" Wilder considered the question carefully, as he did most things. "Sometimes I regret that other students had to witness what I went through, that it might have made them feel like being cruel was acceptable. But for myself, personally, I learned things I needed to learn, about resilience, about the difference between avoiding conflict and choosing peace, about the importance of having people you can trust when everything else is uncertain." "That's very zen of you," Sage teased, but gently. "I'm a work in progress." Wilder smiled. "Still learning when to stand up and when to let things go, when to use capabilities and when to show restraint. But I think that's what it means to be human, constantly figuring out how to balance all these competing values and obligations." Very philosophical. Sage returned to her notes, but she was smiling too. "For what it's worth, I think you handled it with more grace than I would have. I would have snapped and revealed everything after the first video went viral. You're more patient than you think. You endured your own version of targeting for a long time before the truth account." Wilder studied her profile. The concentration in her expression, the way she pushed hair behind her ear when focused, the small tells he'd learned to read over months of proximity. "You stood up when it mattered, when someone else needed defending. That's a kind of courage most people never develop." They worked in companionable silence until the library's closing bell rang, gathering their materials and walking together toward the parking lot. The space looked different now in winter twilight, snow covering the asphalt where the confrontation had happened months ago, transforming the scene into something clean and peaceful. Wilder's actual car was parked nearby, not the Range Rover his father drove, but a more modest vehicle appropriate for a student who was trying to maintain some connection to regular teenage experience despite his family's wealth. He'd offered Sage rides home many times, and tonight she accepted, sliding into the passenger seat and adjusting the heat vents toward her cold hands. "Can I ask you something?" Sage spoke as they pulled out of the parking lot onto the main road. "About that day in the parking lot, when you revealed everything. Was there a part of you that was tempted to actually fight Brad? To use all that training you have and just destroy him physically?" Wilder drove in silence for a moment, navigating the evening traffic while considering his answer honestly. "Yes, absolutely yes. There was a part of me that wanted to show him what real power looked like, that wanted to humiliate him the way he'd humiliated me, that wanted to make him feel physically afraid. That part was loud, especially in the moment when he was threatening you. But you didn't. But I didn't. Because giving in to that impulse would have made me the same as him, someone using their advantages to dominate people who couldn't fight back. He couldn't fight back against my actual capabilities any more than I could fight back against his social position when I was pretending to be poor. Using my training to hurt him would have been the same abuse of power, just wearing a different mask." Sage processed this, watching the darkening landscape pass outside her window. "Do you think he learned anything? Brad, I mean. Do you think getting expelled and humiliated and losing everything changed him at all?" "I don't know," Wilder admitted. "I hope so. I hope he's somewhere reflecting on why his behavior was wrong, developing empathy, becoming someone better. But even if he doesn't change, even if he just learns to hide his cruelty better, at least he's not at Ridgemont anymore. At least the students who come after us won't have to deal with him." He pulled up in front of Sage's house, a modest single-family home in a middle-class neighborhood, not wealthy by Ridgemont standards but comfortable, well-maintained, reflecting a family that prioritized education and stability, even if they couldn't afford the extreme affluence many of their school peers enjoyed. "Thanks for the ride," Sage said, but she didn't immediately get out. And thanks for everything else. For being honest with me even when you couldn't tell me everything. For standing up when it mattered. For being the kind of person who actually tries to live according to principles instead of just talking about them. Same to you, Wilder replied. I couldn't have gotten through any of this without you. They sat in the car for another moment, the engine idling, both aware that something unspoken hung between them, but neither quite ready to name it or act on it. Finally, Sage opened the door, letting in cold air that broke the spell, and stepped out into the snowy driveway. See you tomorrow, she asked. See you tomorrow, he confirmed. The school year continued its progression through winter into spring, each season bringing subtle changes to Ridgemont's culture. The anti-bullying policies began showing effects, not perfection, because institutional change was never immediate or complete, but improvement. Students felt more comfortable reporting harassment. Teachers received training on recognizing different forms of intimidation. The social hierarchy remained, because some level of stratification was inevitable in any human group, but it became less rigid, less cruel, more permeable to movement and challenge. Wilder maintained his dual existence, technically heir to significant wealth, practically living like a regular student in his studio apartment, careful not to let privilege separate him from the experiences of classmates whose families actually struggled financially. He volunteered as a tutor in the newly established peer support program his father had funded, helping students who needed extra academic help, building relationships across economic lines that had previously seemed impenetrable. He also continued training at Master Chen's dojo, maintaining the martial arts discipline that had shaped so much of his character and capabilities. But now, when he practiced, he thought less about fighting and more about the philosophy underlying the techniques. The emphasis on using minimum force to achieve maximum effect, on protecting yourself without destroying others, on winning confrontations not through violence but through control and redirection of energy. You have achieved something rare, Master Chen told him one evening after a particularly intense training session. You have been tested outside the dojo in real circumstances with real stakes, and you chose not to fight. That is the highest expression of martial skill, to have capability but choose restraint, to have power but exercise wisdom. It didn't feel wise, Wilder admitted. It felt hard. Every day, choosing not to respond violently felt like losing. That is because you had not yet understood that winning and fighting are not the same thing. Master Chen smiled. You won, Wilder. You defeated your opponents without striking them. You changed your environment without using force. You protected yourself while maintaining your humanity. That is victory in its most complete form. Spring brought homecoming dance preparations, an event that typically reinforced Ridgemont's social hierarchies, but that felt different this year under new administrative guidance. The dance committee included students from diverse backgrounds rather than just the popular crowd. The planning emphasized inclusion and accessibility, with tickets priced to accommodate all families and decorations created through collaborative effort rather than expensive outsourcing. Wilder found himself on that committee, volunteered by Sage, who'd been appointed as a student representative, and who'd immediately insisted she needed help from someone with better taste than Brad Cunningham ever had. They spent afternoons after school in the gymnasium, hanging lights and arranging tables and debating color schemes, with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the actual stakes involved. I think the blue and silver looks better, Sage insisted, holding up fabric swatches against the gym's walls. The burgundy and gold matches the school colors, Wilder countered, plus it's more elegant. Since when do you care about elegant? Since I've been living in a studio apartment and realized how much I appreciate beauty when I actually get to see it. He stepped back, considering both options. But you're right. Blue and silver is better, more unexpected. I'm always right, Sage declared with exaggerated confidence. You should just trust my judgment automatically. Your judgment that told you to confront Presley publicly in English class last week. That was justified, Sage defended herself. She was being deliberately obtuse about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby, and someone needed to correct her. You made her cry. She was being willfully ignorant to prove some point about how caring about literature is stupid. She deserved accurate critical analysis delivered in a firm tone. Wilder laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible months ago. This was what normal felt like. Teasing friendship, petty debates about decoration choices, the comfortable rhythm of spending time with someone who understood you without requiring constant explanation. The homecoming dance itself was more successful than anyone anticipated. Students who'd never attended school events before showed up, drawn by the promise of actually being welcome rather than tolerated. The music was diverse rather than defaulting to whatever the popular crowd preferred. The atmosphere felt genuinely celebratory rather than exclusive. Wilder attended with Sage, not as a romantic date, though several people assumed that's what they were, but as friends who enjoyed each other's company and wanted to experience this milestone together. They danced badly, laughed frequently, and left early to get pizza at a nearby restaurant where they dissected the evening's drama and discussed the subtle ways Ridgemont continued evolving. It's not perfect, Sage observed, stealing a piece of pepperoni from Wilder's slice despite having ordered her own. There are still cliques, still people who look down on others, still casual cruelties that happen in bathrooms and parking lots where teachers don't see. But it's better, Wilder said. Not fixed, not solved, but better. And better is progress. Such an optimist. Sage smiled, but it was warm, affectionate. I remember when you first showed up at Ridgemont, looking miserable and scared, and like you wanted to disappear into the walls. Now you're Mr. Glass Half Full. I remember when you raised your hand in class, and I could see how much you braced yourself for mockery before speaking. Wilder met her eyes across the table. Now you correct Presley without hesitation. We've both changed. They sat in the pizza place until closing time, reluctant to end the evening, both aware that something was shifting between them, even if neither was ready to name it explicitly. The friendship they'd built was too important to risk with premature romantic complications, but the potential hummed between them like electricity waiting for connection. The school year progressed toward its conclusion. Final exams approached with their usual stress and intensity. College applications consumed much of the senior student's attention, including Wilder's, though his family's wealth meant he had advantages many classmates lacked. Test prep tutors, application consultants, the ability to visit campuses without worrying about travel costs. He found himself grappling with questions about what he owed the world, given his privilege. What responsibility came with being born into circumstances he'd done nothing to earn. His experience pretending to be poor had been temporary, voluntary, safe, in the knowledge that his real life waited whenever he chose to return to it. For students like some of his classmates, poverty wasn't a character-building exercise, but an inescapable daily reality that limited options and opportunities in ways he was only beginning to understand. These questions led him to discussions with his father about the future of Ashford Educational Holdings, about their philosophy toward the schools they acquired, about how to balance financial sustainability with genuine commitment to educational equity. Marcus Ashford had built his fortune through careful investments and strategic acquisitions, but he'd also maintained a consistent focus on social responsibility, believing that wealth generated moral obligations to improve communities and create opportunities for others. The easy thing is to acquire Ridgemont, implement surface changes, claim victory, and move on to the next property, his father said during one of their weekly dinners at the estate. The hard thing is to stay engaged, to keep pushing for deeper transformation, to recognize that changing culture takes years of sustained effort and can never be considered complete. Are we staying engaged? Wilder asked. We are. I've committed to at least 5 years of active oversight, and I'm recruiting a new head of school who shares our values and vision. Beyond that, I'm establishing an endowment specifically for financial aid, to ensure that Ridgemont becomes genuinely accessible to talented students, regardless of family income. Because of what I documented about how students treat each other across economic lines? Partially, but also because it's right. Because education is the most powerful tool for social mobility, and gatekeeping it behind financial barriers perpetuates inequality across generations. Marcus studied his son across the table. You understand that now, in a way you couldn't have before you lived it. That understanding is valuable. Don't lose it as you age, and wealth becomes more normalized again in your daily experience. Wilder promised he wouldn't, though he recognized the promise would require constant effort to maintain, constant resistance against the seductive comfort of privilege that insulated you from others' struggles. The final weeks of school arrived with warm weather, and that particular bittersweet quality of endings that had been earned through difficulty. Wilder and Sage spent increasing amounts of time together, their friendship deepening through shared experiences and mutual support as they navigated college decisions and final exams and the uncertainty of what came next. One afternoon in late May, sitting in their corner of the library with textbooks ignored on the table between them, Sage asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for months. What happens to us after graduation? What do you mean? Wilder knew exactly what she meant, but wanted to hear her articulate it. I mean, we've become really important to each other. But we're also going to different colleges, probably in different states, definitely with different social contexts. Do we stay in touch? Do we try to maintain this friendship across distance? Or do we acknowledge that this was specific to Ridgemont and let it end naturally? Wilder set down his pen, giving her his full attention. What do you want to happen? I want... Sage paused, searching for honest words. I want to believe that what we built here is strong enough to survive transition. That we matter enough to each other to make the effort, despite distance and new experiences and all the reasons relationships fade when circumstances change. We do. Wilder's certainty was absolute. Matter enough, I mean. You're not just my Ridgemont friend, Sage. You're my person. The one who stood by me when it cost you something to do it. The one who sees me clearly and likes what she sees anyway. That doesn't disappear because we end up at different schools. Promise? Her voice was smaller, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. I promise. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his, the gesture simple but weighted with meaning they'd been circling around for months. Besides, I'm planning to visit frequently. My father's committed to ongoing Ridgemont oversight, which means I'll be around regularly. You're not getting rid of me easily. Sage's smile was relieved, hopeful. Good. Because I've gotten used to having you around, it would be inconvenient to have to find a new favorite person. They remained in the library until closing, hands loosely linked across the table, comfortable in silence and in conversation, already practicing the kind of relationship that could accommodate distance because it was built on foundations deeper than proximity. Graduation arrived with all the ceremony and emotion such milestones carried. Families filled Ridgemont's auditorium, cameras flashing, voices calling out names as students crossed the stage to receive diplomas that represented years of work and growth and survival. Wilder walked across that stage to enthusiastic applause, aware that his reception was different now than it would have been months ago, coloured by knowledge of his background, by appreciation for how he'd handled his circumstances, by respect earned through character rather than inherited through wealth. Sage received her diploma with similar applause, her academic achievements recognised formally, even though she'd always known she was smart, regardless of social status. Her family erupted in cheers when her name was called, their pride evident and infectious. At the reception afterward, on Ridgemont's front lawn, under a tent where refreshments were served and graduates mingled with families and teachers, Wilder found himself in conversation with several students who'd been present during that parking lot confrontation months ago. "I just wanted to say," one of them began hesitantly, a student named Maya, who'd been part of Brad's peripheral social circle but had distanced herself after his expulsion, "that watching how you handled everything changed how I think about responding to conflict. You could have destroyed Brad physically, and everyone would have cheered. But you didn't, and that taught me more about strength than any actual fight would have." Others echoed similar sentiments, sharing how witnessing that confrontation and its aftermath had influenced their own choices when facing cruelty or intimidation. Some had stood up to bullies in their own contexts. Some had befriended students they'd previously ignored. Some had simply become more conscious of how they treated others when power dynamics were unequal. Wilder accepted their words with gratitude, recognizing that his father's experiment had achieved something beyond just documenting problems. It had modeled an alternative approach to conflict that some students had internalized and were carrying forward into their own lives. Later, as the sun set and families began departing and the graduates clustered in small groups, making final promises to stay in touch that most wouldn't keep, Wilder found Sage sitting on a low wall at the edge of campus, still wearing her graduation gown, looking contemplative. He sat beside her without asking permission, the ease of long familiarity making words unnecessary. They watched the last light fade from the sky, painting clouds in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed almost artificially vivid. "I'm going to miss this place," Sage said after a long silence. "Even with everything that happened, even with Brad and Presley and all the rest, I'm going to miss it." "Because of what we learned here?" Wilder suggested. "Because of who we became here." She looked at him directly. "I came to Ridgemont as someone who was smart but scared, who wanted to hide rather than stand out, who'd convinced herself that being invisible was the same as being safe. I'm leaving as someone who knows how to fight for what matters, who isn't afraid of being seen, who has at least one person in the world who genuinely knows her." "Only one?" Wilder pretended to be offended. "What about all those other friends you've accumulated? Okay, fine. Several people who know me. But you know me best." She bumped her shoulder against his. "Thank you for that. For seeing me when I was trying not to be seen." "Thank you for the same," Wilder replied, "for recognizing that the person wearing worn-out shoes was still a person worth knowing." They sat together until full darkness had fallen, and campus security began making rounds to clear stragglers, gently reminding graduates that the ceremony was over, that it was time to move forward into whatever came next. Wilder and Sage walked to the parking lot together, one final time, their footsteps echoing in the space where so much had happened months before. "Different schools, same values," Sage said at her car, a statement that was half promise, half hope. "Different schools, same values," Wilder agreed, "and frequent visits, and constant communication, and the knowledge that we built something real here that doesn't end just because geography changes." She hugged him then, fierce and tight, holding on for several seconds before releasing and stepping back. "Drive safe, Wilder James Ashford. I'll see you soon." "See you soon, Sage Whitmore." He watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the night, before walking to his own car. Not the modest student vehicle anymore that had been returned once graduation made the cover story unnecessary, but also not the Range Rover or anything ostentatious. Something in between, representing the balance he was still learning to strike between privilege and humility, between accepting advantages and remaining aware of their implications. The drive back to his father's estate took him through neighborhoods he'd come to know well during his months living in disguise. The modest apartments where families worked multiple jobs to make rent, the single-family homes where parents sacrificed luxuries to ensure their children had opportunities, the wealthier enclaves where such struggles were abstractions rather than lived realities. He understood now, in ways he couldn't have before, how arbitrary the distribution of resources was, how much of success came down to circumstances of birth rather than merit or effort. That understanding would shape everything that came next: his college choices, his eventual career, his ongoing involvement with Ashford Educational Holdings, and his father's mission to make quality education genuinely accessible. The experiment at Ridgemont hadn't just documented problems, it had fundamentally changed how Wilder understood the world and his place in it. His father was waiting when he arrived home, sitting in the study with papers spread across the desk, but clearly having paused his work to wait for his son's return. "How was graduation?" Marcus asked. "Meaningful," Wilder replied, dropping into a leather chair across from the desk. "More than I expected. Students came up to me, told me how watching what happened influenced them, how they'd started thinking differently about power and responsibility." "That's the ripple effect," his father said with satisfaction. "One person choosing principle over convenience, and it spreads outward, touches others, changes culture incrementally. This is why the experiment mattered, not just to fix one school, but to demonstrate what's possible when someone with advantages uses them wisely." They talked deep into the night about Ridgemont's progress, about challenges still remaining, about other schools Ashford Educational Holdings was considering acquiring. Wilder found himself genuinely excited about the work, about being part of something larger than individual success, about using resources to create opportunities rather than simply accumulating more privilege. In the days and weeks that followed graduation, life settled into a new rhythm. Wilder prepared for college, attended orientation sessions, purchased textbooks and dorm supplies. He maintained constant contact with Sage through texts and video calls, their friendship evolving to accommodate distance without diminishing in intensity. He continued training at Master Chen's dojo, finding in the physical discipline a centering force that helped him process ongoing growth and change. He also returned to Ridgemont periodically, ostensibly to help his father with ongoing oversight, but really to check on the culture, to see if the improvements were sticking or fading as memory of recent crises dimmed. He was pleased to find that changes appeared to be holding. New students reported feeling welcomed. Teachers were more actively engaged in addressing conflicts. The social hierarchy had become more fluid and less cruel. On one of these visits, he ran into Presley Monroe in the hallway, the girl who'd tormented Sage with false concern and cutting observations. She saw him, started to turn away, then stopped herself and walked over with visible effort. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble, "for how I treated Sage, and for being part of the general culture that made this place toxic. I've been doing some reflection, some mandatory, some voluntary, about why I acted that way, and I don't have great answers. Insecurity, mostly. Fear that if I wasn't putting someone else down, I'd be the one getting targeted." Wilder studied her expression, looking for insincerity, finding instead genuine discomfort and what seemed like actual regret. "Have you apologized to Sage?" "I tried. She hasn't responded to my messages yet." Presley's face tightened with what might have been shame. "I don't blame her. I said some cruel things." "Keep trying," Wilder advised. Genuine apologies sometimes take time to land, especially when the hurt was deep. But don't give up. She'll hear you eventually if you're sincere. Presley nodded, accepting the guidance, and walked away with shoulders that carried themselves differently than they had months ago. Less arrogant certainty, more tentative searching for better ways to exist in the world. Summer passed in productive activity, internship at his father's company, continued training, college preparation, visits with Sage when their schedules aligned. Each visit reinforced that their connection wasn't dependent on constant proximity, that they'd built something resilient enough to flex without breaking. Fall arrived with college beginning, new environments demanding adaptation, the particular stress and excitement of starting over in unfamiliar contexts. Wilder found himself drawing on lessons from Ridgemont about staying true to values even when circumstances were difficult, about building genuine connections rather than seeking status, about using advantages to help others rather than to elevate himself. His roommate was surprised by some of his choices: the modest dorm room rather than expensive off-campus housing, the cafeteria meals rather than constant takeout, the preference for used textbooks rather than new ones. When asked about it, Wilder simply said he'd learned some things about what actually mattered, about the difference between having resources and needing to display them constantly. He volunteered as a tutor through the university's community outreach program, helping local high school students navigate college applications and financial aid forms. He joined the martial arts club not to compete, but to train with others who appreciated discipline and technique. He found study groups and conversation partners and slowly assembled a social circle based on shared interests and values rather than background or wealth. Through all of this, Sage remained a constant presence, physically distant but emotionally close, someone he talked to nearly every day, who understood his references and appreciated his growth, who was navigating her own college experience with characteristic intelligence and determination. "I think I want to study education policy," she told him during one of their video calls, her face pixelated but expression clear. "I keep thinking about Ridgemont, about how much influence administrators and institutional structures have over student experiences. If I could help shape those systems to be more equitable, more responsive to actual student needs, that feels meaningful." "You'd be incredible at that," Wilder said with absolute certainty. "You understand from lived experience what policies need to address, and you have the analytical skills to translate that understanding into actionable reforms." They talked about potential graduate programs, about career paths in education or policy or non-profit work, about the various ways people with privilege and passion could work toward more just systems. These weren't idle conversations or abstract philosophical exercises. They were planning sessions for lives dedicated to principles they'd developed through hardship and observation. Thanksgiving break brought them both back to Connecticut, to families and familiar landscapes, and the opportunity to see each other in person for the first time in months. They met at a coffee shop near Ridgemont, sitting across from each other with steaming mugs, catching up on details that hadn't made it into texts or calls. Wilder noticed changes in her immediately, more confidence in her posture, more ease in her expression, the visible evidence of someone who was thriving in an environment that valued her strengths rather than punishing them. She clearly noticed changes in him too, commenting on how he seemed more settled, more comfortable in his own skin. "College suits you," she observed. "You don't have that watchful quality anymore, like you're constantly anticipating attacks." "I'm not pretending anymore," Wilder replied. "I'm just being who I actually am, which turns out to be a lot less exhausting than maintaining a cover story." "And who is Wilder Ashford when he's not pretending?" Sage asked with genuine curiosity. "Someone who cares about fairness, who values genuine connection, who wants to use whatever advantages he has to make things better for others." He paused, then added, "Someone who's grateful for having found his person back in high school, who knows how rare that is, who doesn't take it for granted." Sage's expression softened. His person. I like that phrase. It's accurate. Wilder held her gaze. You're my person, Sage. Distance doesn't change that. They spent hours in that coffee shop, talking until the staff began putting chairs up on tables and giving pointed looks toward the clock. When they finally left, walking out into cold November air, neither was ready to say goodbye. This is the hard part about the whole distance thing, Sage said, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. Knowing I don't get to see you tomorrow, or next week, or even next month, unless we specifically plan for it. We'll plan for it, Wilder promised, as often as possible, and in the meantime, we keep building toward futures that can eventually exist in the same geographic location. That's a very practical approach to what might be a romantic relationship developing, Sage teased, though her tone was gentle. Might be. Wilder raised an eyebrow. I thought we'd established that a while ago. I mean, we've never actually defined it explicitly. We've just kind of been existing in this space of more than friends without naming what that means. Okay. Wilder stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Let's name it. I care about you in ways that go beyond friendship. I think about you constantly. I want to be part of your life, not just now, but long-term, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with. And I've felt this way since approximately the moment you reported that lunch video and stood up when nobody else would. Sage was quiet for a moment, processing his words, her breath visible in small clouds in the cold air. Then she smiled, genuine, bright, unguarded. I care about you in the same ways, and I want the same things, so I guess we're dating now. Officially. Officially, Wilder agreed, and the simplicity of finally naming what had been building for months felt right, inevitable, earned through shared experience rather than rushed into prematurely. They stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, 18 years old and full of potential, having survived something difficult and emerged with character forged in adversity. The future spread before them with all its uncertainty and possibility, but they faced it together, anchored by mutual understanding and shared values and the knowledge that they'd found something rare worth protecting. Years later, when people asked Wilder about his high school experience, he would tell a version of the story, edited for privacy, simplified for comprehension, but fundamentally true. About going to a school in disguise, about experiencing cruelty and choosing not to respond with cruelty, about finding genuine connection in unexpected places, about learning that power's highest expression was restraint rather than dominance. He would emphasize the lessons that had shaped everything that came after, that privilege carried moral obligations, that character was tested in hardship, that standing up for others often required standing up for yourself first, that mercy was stronger than revenge, that transformation was always possible for those willing to do the difficult work of change. And when younger people asked for advice about handling bullying or navigating social hierarchies or surviving environments that felt hostile, he would share what he'd learned through experience. Stay true to who you are, even when circumstances make that difficult. Find your people and hold on to them. Use whatever advantages you have to help others rather than to dominate them. And remember that winning doesn't always look like victory in the moment. Sometimes it looks like maintaining your humanity when everything encourages you to lose it. Sage would usually be there for these conversations, adding her own perspectives, sharing what she'd learned about being underestimated and choosing to see that as opportunity rather than limitation, about using outsider status to maintain clarity about systems that insiders accepted without question. Together, they built lives dedicated to making education more equitable. Wilder through his work with Ashford Educational Holdings and various non-profit boards. Sage through her research and advocacy in policy circles. They attended conferences, published articles, gave talks, and slowly contributed to shifts in how institutions approach student welfare and cultural development. They married after graduate school in a ceremony that deliberately mixed guests from vastly different economic backgrounds, making visible their commitment to building bridges across divisions that most people accepted as natural and inevitable. Their wedding wasn't the most expensive or elaborate, but it was meaningful, filled with people who'd shaped them and whom they'd shaped in return. And through all of it, through career developments and setbacks, through policy victories and defeats, through the ordinary joys and struggles of building a life together, they carried forward the lessons learned in Ridgemont's halls, parking lot, and library corners. About courage and restraint, about justice and mercy, about the power that came from choosing to be better than circumstances demanded. The shoes that had started everything, the worn canvas sneakers that Brad Cunningham had mocked on that September morning, Wilder kept in a box in his closet, not as a trophy or symbol of triumph, but as a reminder of what it felt like to be vulnerable, to be targeted, to face each day knowing that cruelty waited around corners and in cafeterias and on social media feeds. Of the importance of remembering that feeling even as life carried him further from its immediate reality. Of the obligation to ensure that future students wouldn't have to endure what he'd documented, that systems would protect rather than abandon the vulnerable, that adults would intervene rather than look away. Some mornings, getting ready for another day of work, trying to make schools safer and more equitable and more just, Wilder would look at those shoes and remember Brad's face. Not in the parking lot when everything had changed, but in those early hallways when he'd been so confident in his cruelty, so certain that power meant freedom to hurt others without consequence. He would remember, and then he would go out and do the work of ensuring that fewer people like Brad were created by systems that rewarded domination, and that more people like Sage were supported by institutions that valued character over status. Because that was the point of everything, not revenge, not personal victory, but fundamental transformation of the environments that shaped young people's understanding of how to treat each other. The long game his father had talked about, played out across decades rather than months, measured in cultural shifts rather than individual confrontations. And on the days when the work felt overwhelming, when progress seemed impossibly slow, when he questioned whether any of it mattered in the face of entrenched systems and resistant attitudes, Sage would remind him about that parking lot revelation, about the students who'd told him that witnessing his restraint had changed how they thought about power and response. One person choosing differently creates ripples, she would say, echoing his father's words from years ago. We're creating ripples. They'll spread further than we can see, touch more people than we'll ever know about. That's enough. That has to be enough. And it was. Not perfect, not complete, never finished, but enough. Enough to justify the difficult days, enough to provide meaning, enough to build a life around. The heir in worn sneakers had learned what he needed to learn, had become who he needed to become, and had found his person to share the journey with. The rest was just living it forward, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one opportunity at a time, to demonstrate that strength included compassion, that power required wisdom, and that victory meant maintaining your humanity even when the world gave you every excuse to lose it. That was the story. That was the lesson. That was what endured long after the shoes had worn out and the memories had faded and the specific details had become less important than the principles they illustrated. Choose restraint over retaliation. Choose mercy over revenge. Choose to build others up rather than tear them down. Choose to be better than the worst things that happened to you. Choose again and again, across a lifetime of moments both dramatic and mundane, to be someone whose presence made spaces safer, kinder, more just. That was real power. That was true victory. That was what mattered when everything else had fallen away. And somewhere in Connecticut, at a school called Ridgemont Academy, new students walked halls that were incrementally safer than they'd been before, benefiting from policies and attitudes that had been shaped by one person's willingness to endure hardship in service of understanding, and another person's courage to shine light on darkness, even when it was easier to look away. The work continued. The ripples spread. The world changed in small ways that accumulated into larger transformations, and Wilder Ashford, who'd once worn worn-out shoes and eaten humble lunches and absorbed cruelty with quiet dignity, drove to work each morning in his deliberately modest car, carrying forward the lessons he'd learned and the mission he'd embraced, grateful for the difficult journey that had taught him what truly mattered. His person beside him, their shared values guiding them, their commitment to justice sustaining them through challenges and setbacks, and the long, patient work of making the world more humane, one institution at a time. That was how the story ended. Not with a final confrontation, not with complete resolution, but with ongoing commitment to principles discovered through hardship and maintained through discipline. The heir in worn sneakers had become something better than rich, better than powerful, better than vindicated. He'd become someone who used advantages wisely, who stood up for others consistently, who chose mercy over revenge every single day. And that, ultimately, was the point of everything.